I'm Paul Edwards, author of the Mourners Woods books, and first and foremost, a monster kid. Tonight, I'm watching When a Stranger Calls from 2006. Now, before you say it, I already know what you're thinking. But Paul, When a Stranger Calls 2006 was only a remake of a 1979 film, which is also on this disc. Why don't you do a review of that one? Because that's better. That's a good question, and here's the answer. Because you can already find 100 other videos reviewing the 1979 When a Stranger Calls. Given the choice, I'm always going to review the more obscure, lesser-known movie. That's why you've never seen me do a review of like the 1931 Frankenstein or the 1931 Dracula, because you can already find 10,000 videos online that review those movies. I like to go with a lesser known one that maybe doesn't have as many reviews out there. So yes, let's get this out of the way right now. The original When a Stranger Calls from 1979, starring Carol Kane, is a superior movie. No dispute about that. But we're talking tonight about When a Stranger Calls from 2006, starring Camilla Belle. If you have never seen either of these films, then I probably ought to explain to you the original film and then talk about what they did and didn't do when they remade it. So, spoilers for the first movie, okay? The first movie is in 3 acts. The first act is about a babysitter played by Carol Kane, and she's supposed to be watching children who are upstairs in bed asleep. She just has to watch the house until the parents come back. But she keeps getting phone calls from an unknown caller saying, "Have you checked the children? Why haven't you checked the children?" And finally, she reports this to the police, and the police trace the call, and they call her back. And in a shocking moment, they say, "The calls are coming from inside the house." It turns out the maniac was on an extension upstairs in the same house and was calling her after he had already killed the kids, and he was trying to lure her upstairs. That's Act 1. Act 2 is years later. The maniac escapes from the psychiatric institute and is being chased by a detective. Act 3 brings us back to the babysitter, now all grown up with kids of her own, and she's out to dinner one night with her husband, and a phone call comes in for her saying, "Have you checked the children?" And of course, she realizes her own family is in danger now. So that's the 3-act story of the 1979 When a Stranger Calls. One thing that I think they did right in doing the remake was to only remake Act 1. That really was a good idea, because honestly, all anybody remembered about the first movie was Act 1. That's all anybody talked about, all anybody cared about. The rest was sort of an afterthought. The golden piece of the story was Act 1. And so I think that they were right to remake Act 1 as a complete movie in this 2006 version. And in this, Camilla Belle plays the teenager, Jill Johnson, who is babysitting for a wealthy family who have a large and a little unusual house. I'll get to that in a minute. And in this same scenario, the children are upstairs in bed, recovering from a cold, and don't bother them, just leave them up there. And she starts getting the phone calls saying, "Have you checked the children?" Okay. One problem is it's not 1979 anymore. It's 2006. People are a lot more savvy about technology, and a lot more technology is available to the average person. In 1979, there were only landline telephones. There were no cell phones. Now there's, 30 different ways you can communicate with someone. You don't even need a cell phone. You could do it over the internet. And Jill Johnson could be getting these phone calls from anywhere, and it would be no surprise that they are coming from inside the house, really. Another difference in this movie that I think is not an improvement is that they made the house a little too lavishly, opulently rich. The family has a sort of an indoor terrarium where they have birds in an aviary right in the center of their house. And, it's certainly not something that would be in a typical suburban home, which the whole point of the story is that it is taking place in a typical suburban home, and it's happening to a typical suburban girl. And, this kind of terrible horror can strike at someone just living a regular, everyday life. The Mandrakis house in this story is not a regular, everyday house. It's an unusual setting. And I think that subtracts some from the premise of the original. But overall, this movie follows the basic story structure of Act 1 of the original. The terrifying calls come and start saying, "Have you checked the children?" They don't do it anywhere near as many times as in the original. But eventually, it turns out, of course, this is not even a spoiler if you've seen the first one. It turns out that the maniac has access to the house and is terrorizing her from right nearby. Okay, so here are my thoughts on the 2006 version. It's possible to do everything right and still fail. It's possible for an athlete to make all the right moves and still lose the game. It's possible for a lawyer to make all the right arguments and still lose the trial, or for a surgeon to perform all the right techniques and the patient still die. They actually did a lot of things right in this film, but it was a complete failure anyway. And at first I had trouble pinpointing why it was a failure. I don't have a problem with Camilla Bell. I like Camilla Bell. I've seen her in other things. And, she was perfectly fine at being the leading lady in this picture. Most of the way that they executed the scares in this were fairly well done. And this was a well shot movie. It was a little dark, but it was well shot. And I think that some of the things they did to flesh out the story to a full 90 minutes, like adding characters who come and visit her, things like that, were necessary improvements in order to make the story long. But I think they worked pretty well. Having the housekeeper there for a brief time, and then having her friend from school come over to visit her briefly. Both of those were okay to put in here. I don't think those were missteps. Also, having the guest house on the other side of the property where maybe the college-age son from Dr. Mandrakis' first marriage is over there staying, or maybe it's really the maniac over there. That is a reasonably good element too, because it gave Jill Johnson something to do, to have to go over to that house and look around there. And then, of course, the terrifying phone call comes over there. So a lot of those story elements really worked in this. And finally, I decided that there was only one real mistake that they made in this film, and that was to even make it in the first place. It was just a mistake to try to recapture the magic of the first act of 1979, When a Stranger Calls. The time had passed. We weren't in the age of landline phones anymore. And, everybody in the horror community certainly already knew the story, so we weren't going to be surprised when the phone call came from inside the house. And they had to stretch it out. They did the best they could. So I think this is an example of where you can do everything right and still lose, because they shouldn't have undertaken to even try to remake this. If they were going to remake When a Stranger Calls, I think they did all the right things, doing only the first act, modernizing it a little bit in terms of the technology, having the extra characters, all of those things I think were correct steps. They just shouldn't have even tried to do it in the first place. And if teenagers being terrorized by homicidal stalkers is your thing, have I got a book for you. My first published novel, Mourners Woods, tells the story of a shy, intellectual teenage girl who's enduring daily bullying at her high school in rural Montana. Strangely, the cool kids one day invite her to party with them on Halloween night out in Mourners Woods, Mourners Woods has been off limits ever since another local teenager disappeared out there last Halloween. So when our heroine, Dinah, accepts this invitation, she goes out into Mourners Woods with the school bullies, and it turns out that the reason they have lured her out into Mourners Woods is that they plan to kill her. They plan to sacrifice her to a popular internet monster that they've discovered online. Dinah, the main character, momentarily escapes from them and has to run for her life through this remote wilderness, being chased by the homicidal bullies on Halloween night. But who has set the real trap? Which teenager is really the stalker? It could be that Dinah, our heroine, is not nearly the victim that it at first seems that she is. And the real question becomes, who is going to survive Halloween night in Mourners Woods? This book, like all of my books, is available on Amazon. I will drop a link in the description for this video. Thanks for letting me talk to you about When a Stranger Calls, 2006. I'll see you in Mourners Woods.